It's time to actually begin. We'll start with course chapter 1. Again, I might suggest as you go through each slide of psychology that you and its major take notes on the narration when it's needed, and also the websites with that, we're off when they appear, since these questions will appear on quizzes and tests. Ready or not, hopefully ready, let's begin chapter 1A. When you're finished, go on to chapter 1B. If you're wondering why I'm using 1A and 1B, it's not theoretically driven. It's just that Brightspace had limitations on uploading files, and the original chapter 1 without the 1A and 1B was too big to upload. So there you go. So hopefully it'll be a good start for you, and we're off and running. If we were able to meet in a traditional manner, I would begin my course by giving you a 13-question quiz on psychology, just to see what you know at this point. And when I'm done, I'd have you switch with your neighbors to keep everybody honest. So I'd ask you to take this little quiz right now and record the answers perhaps in your notebook. And then we'll see what we know to start, and it'll show us some of the directions we'll be heading in the course. So again, please actually take it. Are you ready to see how you did? Let's start with the most basic question, the father of psychology. Did you put Sigmund Freud, Ivan Pavlov, B.F. Skinner, or Wilhelm Wundt? It was actually Wilhelm Wundt. You might never have heard of his name before, and that's perfectly fine, but still, he is the father of psychology. Right now, let's look at the general time period psychology was founded. Later on, you'll have to learn the exact date, but that's later. Which do you choose? Psychology is a fairly young science, began in the 1800s. And as I mentioned, soon we'll learn the exact date, 1879. Next, animals and psychology experiments. A little, a lot, that's the question. Normally I'd have people raise their hands for the quiz that they're grading, and I'd start with less than 1 or 10, and maybe 1 or 2 people per class who'd raise their hands, and one of those 2 people might get it right. The correct answer is 10%. And that's with a little bit of rounding. Some years it's 7, some years it's 6.5, and so on. But almost 10%. So if you're putting 60 to 70 or more than 75, whoo, you're off. Next, let's look at the insanity defense as used in criminal court cases. And I often ask here if anybody's a criminal justice program person, because those teachers will give you the same number that I will give you. I'll ask the same question as the previous question. I ask people to raise their hands if the quiz they're grading had less than 1 or 10% circled. It would in fact be considerably less than 1%. So I tell people jokingly that if they got this question wrong, they're probably watching too many TV sitcom dramas. And if you're watching too much TV, I will help you with this problem. For number 5, we have much better odds, 50-50. True, false, Alzheimer's is a treatable condition. Indeed, that is true. If you're feeling surprised, why? It is treatable. Many students say, well, it's not curable. Well, treatable means it can be treated. It's very different from the word curable. For example, if I ask you, is diabetes curable? People will say no. Treatable, yes, and so on. So it is a treatable condition. I can remember where I taught when the first medication came out. That was back when I was at Watertown at Jefferson Community College, quite a long time ago. Let's consider number 6, the term psychotic or psychoses, if used correctly. The key to that is out of touch with reality. If you selected dangerous, it has nothing to do with dangerous. Actually, a sad fact for women, you're most likely to be either injured intentionally or killed, not by a psychotic person, but by who? And I ask the cast for guesses, and they'll guess boyfriend or husband, or ex-boyfriend or ex-husband, and sadly, that is true. So again, psychotic simply means a person that's out of touch with reality. It means more than having trouble functioning. Specifically, it means out of touch. Next, the one biological question. And I think I'll take a pause here to stop and restart my narration. So later in the course, we'll spend a whole chapter, chapter 3, looking at the biology of psychology. So I thought that one brain-based question might be appropriate. And this I thought would be the most basic one. So the outer wrinkled surface, it'd be the last choice, your cerebral cortex. Next, let's consider smoking. Perhaps you're a smoker, or perhaps you have a smoker in your life that you're trying to move into the non-smoker category. But in any case, how many years on average do you think it shortens a typical lifespan? Current research suggests 10 years. So if you're a smoker, you're going to have to decide if it's worth 10 years of your life. And if you're a non-smoker with a smoker loved one, well, here's a little bit more ammunition for you. Next, let's consider two mental health conditions, schizophrenia and multiple personality disorder. Two names for the same thing, different but related, or two unrelated conditions. It would be the last choice, two totally unrelated conditions with different causes, different symptoms, and different treatments is basically as different as you can get. If you got it wrong, probably again watching too much TV. I can remember a particular MASH episode that misused these terms. So again, if the problem is too much time on your hands watching TV, I will help you with that. Number 10, virtually no scientists accept any of Sigmund Freud. Well, we'll probably collectively make a little fun of some of Freud's idea, but many of Freud's ideas are so basic and so accepted that you might be very surprised that they'll learn they're Freudian. So scientists do believe in certain aspects of Freud's concepts and theories. 11, another true false. Shock treatment, specifically electroconvulsive therapy, is still used in the US. And it would be true. At this point, I usually ask my students, for what condition would be most likely to be used? Many students say epilepsy. No, sorry, not close. It's most likely to be used for mood disorders such as major depression and bipolar disorder, though it is a very rare treatment. Medications typically work very, very effectively, so this is one of our fallback positions. Seldom needed, but occasionally yes. Let's consider 12, our next true false. Memory is typically more accurate under hypnosis. Let me ask it this way. I'd ask my students to raise their hands if they care about their grades in college. And I suggest if you can't raise your hands, this is the wrong place for you right now anyway. Then I ask, are you willing to do the basic things you could to succeed? Again, virtually everybody raises their hands. And then I ask, how many people have secured their hypnosis for the semester? And I say, why not? You say that you want to succeed. You're willing to do what you think it takes. So if you think hypnosis would help, well, then you should probably have secured it. But I'm glad you didn't, because hypnosis will not enhance your memory. In fact, it will introduce more inaccuracies into your memory. But we'll look at that more in the consciousness chapter quite a bit down the road. 13 is my favorite because it's fill in the blank. Blank is the most commonly used psychoactive drug, and since that's a technical term, I explain it. It's a drug that can enter the brain and influence it. I get all sorts of possibilities. LSD, crack, meth. No, I'm not going to have any of those today. I hope you aren't either. That gets students thinking. Alcohol, in the ballpark, but no. Caffeine. So caffeine is a psychoactive drug. It can enter the brain and impact our functioning. I ask if people can get addicted to it, and everybody agrees. And I ask for some of the common symptoms, such as irritability, trouble sleeping, and so on. So caffeine is a psychoactive drug. If you need a little help in the spelling, that's fine. C-A-F-F-E-I-N-E. So go ahead and total the number that you got correct, and please record it somewhere that you can access it later in the course, maybe on the inside cover of your notebook perhaps. I'll tell you to look at that point later on in the course when you'll need it. So if you didn't do well, that's okay. In most classes, I'll get 0 to 2 people that pass it. So why do I bother to do this? Well, first of all, to see what you know, but to also show you what sort of information we'll be learning in the course. So if you did poorly, that's actually good. It's showing me that you don't know everything there is to know about psychology, and therefore you're showing me great potential to learn. And isn't it great to start a course showing superb potential to learn? And you do have superb potential, and I am totally serious. I'd like to introduce you to a very useful symbol. It's a symbol shown in black in the middle of the page and also by the heart. That symbol is called the psi. It's a letter of the Greek alphabet, but importantly for us, the psi has been adopted to be the symbol of psychology. Some textbooks on psychology portray it very prominently on the cover. It's much quicker to write that single letter than it is the word psychology, or even PSYCH is still 5 letters, so I would strongly suggest you practice it a few times and use it. It's very effective, and I think you'll come to like it. So this is our psi. In our second class meeting, I asked my students to take a look at the sheet on the next page and to try to spell all the words. They are all there spelled mixed correctly. The reason I'm doing this is that I think it's a reasonable expectation in college that the fundamental, essential concepts you should be able to spell correctly. In our course, I've limited to 10 words and 10 related words. I did this one year. I was grading final exams. In a couple classes, I had people that were still had students that were misspelling the word psychology. I thought, well, that's unfortunate, not only for the student, but that's also unfortunate for me as a teacher to have let it got that far. So for these 10 words, you will need to have an exact spelling. For the rest of the words in our course, as long as it sounds exactly like it should, you'll be given full credit. Exception for this will be on fill in the blank on the blackboard. To be recognized, blackboard is fussy, so those you will have to be careful with and spell correctly. But for the rest of our words, in other contexts such as hand and work, and misspelling, as long as they're not in these fundamental 10 words, is acceptable. Please go ahead and test yourself on these 10 words. The correct spellings will be on our next slide. So let's see how you did. Psychology, any word that has psych, psychology, psychologist, psychometric, psychiatrist. If you hear the psych, it'll be P-S-Y-C-H. Students often accidentally forget the H. It needs the H. Next one, our father of psychology, one Wilhelm Wundt. Remember that the Germans pronounce their W's with V's, so if you know the musician Wagner, they don't call him Wagner, they call him Wagner. So Wilhelm Wundt. Next, variation of psychology, psychologist. Don't forget the H. Next, conscious. Number 5, unconscious. And 6, conscience. And yes, they do sound a little bit alike, but they're very distinctly different. We'll have a whole chapter on states of consciousness. So let's consider number 4, conscious. We are alert. We're conscious. We're processing information. Unconscious, not alert, not processing. Conscience, number 6, a sense of morality. So conscious, unconscious, and conscience. 7, Pavlov. 8, Maslow. Sometimes students tend to mix and match the letters. Nothing good comes of that. Next, schizophrenia. Don't ever shorten it to schizo. That's very rude. It's very impolite. Don't go there. And it's not even desirable to say a schizophrenic. It's a person with schizophrenia. They're more than their condition. Number 10, our Sigmund Freud, who apparently is not the father of psychology. Let's now consider the definition of psychology. I ask my students sometimes to jot down what they think a word or phrase would be that would best describe what psychology is. Some students tell me mind, and that's not a bad answer. That's where psychology did begin, but it's no longer the current focus, so we need a broader definition. And the best definition, and you'll see it also in your textbook, is behavior. So we will define psychology as a scientific study of behavior. Definitely a very good definition to commit to memory. Other social sciences at SCCC would be sociology, political science, economics, anthropology, and history. Though history is a little bit of an odd duck, depending on the research methods used and the questions asked, it can either be considered a social science or a humanities. So remember, we're focusing on the definition, what is psychology? And we noted it was a scientific study of behavior. So we've mentioned type of science, social science that is. And next we should consider, since behavior is the essential component of our definition, we should consider the basic types of behavior. As you can see in the slide, behaviors can be classified as being either overt or covert. Overt, let's define that as actions which can be directly observed or measured. After you get that into your notes, please consider how we might define covert behaviors, seeing if you can maybe even guess our definition word for word. So for covert behaviors, our definition will be actions which cannot, make the not big and bold, actions which cannot be directly observed or measured. And you might find this puzzling. It's an action, but you can't observe it. Well, let me help you. Think of the mental processes. In psychology, mental processes are considered to be a type of behavior, just a type of covert behavior. So it might help us to clarify the concept of covert behaviors if we could put a few examples now into our notes. So consider what might be examples of covert behaviors might be going on in your mind right now, or if you're sitting in a room with other people, what may be some of the behaviors going on in their minds. So take a moment and list a few possible examples. So there are many, many examples: problem solving, critical thinking, accessing memories, learning, to name just a very, very few. Let's do a little concept check. For each of these, take a moment before I give the answer and decide if you think it's an overt or covert behavior. Note-taking. Well, definitely observable, so that would be an overt behavior. In a typical classroom situation, if everybody around you is taking notes and you're not, unless you have a note taker, that's a problem. I rarely have students pass the course who don't take notes. Even on this sort of medium, virtual, you still need to take notes. Listening. You might want to say that that is an overt behavior, but no, that is covert. In a typical lecture, I cannot tell if students are listening. A student could be, for example, deaf and lip reading. The last example, texting. Well, if a student is engaging in texting under the desk, clearly they think they're engaged in a covert behavior, and it might well remain covert for a little while, but promise sooner or later I will notice it, and I will also often sneak up to them and be lecturing about it, and they're oblivious to that fact. And I'll ask them what they're doing under the desk. I teach human sexuality, so my mind does tend to go in various directions here. And I tell them that whatever they're doing under the desk, it is simply not allowed in the situation. So although the student might want to say covert, your teacher and classmates will definitely strongly say overt. We've now finished the 4 goals of psychology. Now let's consider the 4 W's: who, what, where, and when. Who is referring to the father of psychology. Now, on the first day of class, you might be inclined to say Sigmund Freud, but we will learn that that is not, in fact, the case. It'd be this gentleman on the right, Wilhelm Wundt. And as you might also remember, he's on the "you gotta spell it correctly" list. And that is a little bit problematic. It will take some practice, in particular, his first name. So let's consider that with a little mnemonic that might help us out. Now remember that Wilhelm Wundt must be spelled correctly. He's one of the 10 words on our essential spelling list. And his first name, is it Wilhelm or Wilhem? It's not a common first name in our culture. The one of my colleagues does have that as his middle name. Let me give you a visual mnemonic. So picture him with that black coat there, but at the bottom, maybe a very long, elaborately hemmed skirt. So Wilhelm. Now also picture him in an alternate image. Picture him standing at the helm of a ship, steering the way the ship of psychology will sail. Which do you think will be a better image for us? Probably him at the helm of a ship. So after you put WIL down, think skirt with hemline or helm of a ship, and hopefully you'll go with the helm of the ship. So Wilhelm, WILHELM, and last name WUNDT. So I assume you can spell it quite easily by now since we had that spelling check days ago. So if you have not mastered that list, please take a moment and go back and do so. So the father of psychology, one Wilhelm Wundt, in my most authentic pronunciation that I can master. Next, in terms of where do you think psychology began? Well, with a name like Wilhelm Wundt, if you want to say Germany, indeed you're correct. Would you happen to know the exact city? Once in a while I have a student who does. It's Leipzig, but Germany is fine since I assume that you haven't been there and I definitely have not been there. We'll just say Germany. Now in terms of the when, we learned on our first day of class it was some point in the 1800s. I'll give you a little way of remembering it that might help you out. It involves you being able to count, so hopefully that's not an issue. So jot down 1-8 and focus on the 8. If you're counting, what number comes before 8? Well, 7. Jot that down. And still focus on the 8. What number comes when you're counting after 8? Well, 9. So 1879. So again, you know it's hopefully in the 1800s. Focus on the 8. Remember that you have to count. Do the number before 8 when you count, and the number after 8 when you count. Now let's consider the perspectives, or sometimes they're called the approaches, of psychology. This list is more or less in chronological order, but with quite a few there's substantial overlap. So you're already ready to go to the next slide, and we'll consider the first two approaches to psychology, structuralism and functionalism. So psychology began with the approach called structuralism. I assume you can guess the first structuralist. For definition, the focus would be identifying we can't say the word structures because you really can't define a term with itself. So if I was going to say the structures of something, how could I alternately say the structures of something? Maybe the building blocks, the elements of, perhaps? So identifying the basic structures or perhaps the elements of the mental processes. Now overlapping with this approach was our second approach, functionalism. They continued the work of the structuralists. Their focus was identifying how these mental processes, well, I know you want to put the word functioning, but again, we can't define a term with itself, so give me an alternate term for functioning. If I was going to ask you, how's your car functioning, how else could I say it? Maybe operating or working, both would be fine. So identifying how the mental processes work, how they operate. Now to us, one seems to be a logical continuation of the other, but it was surprising the degree of animosity the structuralists had for the functionalists. The most famous functionalist, indeed, one of the most famous of the early psychologists, William James, once called structuralism dull and nasty, and that's an exact quote. So whereas we might see them complementary, the original psychologists saw them as being distinctly different. Let's now consider an approach which could be called the psychodynamic, or if you prefer, the psychoanalytic perspective. Theorist? Well, it'd be the gentleman in the bottom right. Do you recognize Sigmund Freud? I assume it's an easy to spell name since he's on our list. So I would ask my students to free associate a little bit about Sigmund Freud if I was teaching face-to-face, and ask for what sort of images or terms come to mind. You'll excuse me, but I must pause. So if you're blanking, do you know any terms related to the mind? A set of 3 terms. Id, ego, superego. How about any complexes, like Oedipus or Electra? Have you ever made a Freudian slip? So these would be some of the many terms associated with Freud. What about his emphasis? Well, sexuality and also aggression in terms of human nature. But if I ask you his focus, his main idea, definitely go with the unconsciousness or unconscious mind. So I left a few letters blank for you as an easy review to see how your spelling is going. So let's consider the Gestalt perspective. Country of origin? Well, with a word like Gestalt, if you want to guess German, indeed it is a German approach. Translation? The word gestalt can be translated in various ways, but let's say whole or pattern being particularly useful. I believe your text does take a slightly different tact. So whole or pattern, so the focus would be how the mental processes work together as a whole. So again, as a little recap, structuralists want to identify the basic building blocks, the basic structures of the mental processes. The functionalists, how they functioned, in other words, how they worked, and the Gestalt perspective, how these processes work together as a whole. Let's consider a very famous and very Gestalt saying. I'll start, see if you can finish it. The whole is greater than. If you're thinking the sum of the parts, indeed you are correct. A very Gestalt saying. The whole, W-H-O-L-E sort of whole, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Let's now consider the approach known as behaviorism, though it's also called behavioral, behavioristic, or sometimes just the behavior approach. Major theorists would be the three gentlemen on the bottom. Do you recognize any of them? Or would you like to even guess? One of them is on the must spell correctly list. On the left, one Ivan Pavlov, Nobel laureate. The middle, and you'll eventually get the humor if you don't now, just trust us, it's funny. John B. Watson, and the gentleman on the right, one B.F. Skinner, working with his pigeons. So theorists, Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner. Importance, behaviorism is the only approach to ever dominate American psychology, and not just for a couple of years, such as the presidency, or maybe not like 8 years, a re-elected president, but it dominated American psychology for decade after decade after decade after decade after decade, and it was literally that many decades. And although it's not the dominant approach anymore, it's still a major approach. So the only American approach to dominate psychology. Alternate name, well, its focus is learning, so it's often called the learning approach. Emphasis, as I just noted, the role of learning and environment in our behaviors. At this point, I like to sneak in the concepts of nature and nurture, but I think I'll momentarily pause this. I'd like to turn our focus to the moment of the concepts of nature and nurture. I find a great many of my students confuse these concepts and thus don't know them. It's okay if they're giving you a little bit of difficulty now, but we need to fix that though. Nature, if it's due to nature, is referring to genes, genetics, heredity. Put one of those into your notes. Nurture, due to learning and the environment. So let's pretend that there are two students in the hallway having a vigorous but polite discussion about the causes of alcoholism. One insists it's got to be due to inheriting the genes that predispose you to alcoholism. The other disagrees, saying it's being raised in an environment by somebody who abuses and uses alcohol heavily, who learns to turn to alcohol by watching that model, who maybe is in a culture that also, anytime anything goes bad on a TV show or a movie, doesn't the character turn to alcohol? So they're having the nature and nurture discussion. So the person that's arguing due to learning and environment, is that nature or nurture? Well, nurture, that's one refers to learning environment, whereas again, nature due to genes and genetics. Which does behaviorism emphasize? If you don't know, that's fine. Let me give you a John B. Watson quote. I'm going to do it from memory as well as I can, and then we'll see on the next slide how close I get. Back in 1913, he said, "Give me a dozen infants, my own specified world to raise them in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone by chance and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Artist, lawyer, merchant, chief, or even beggarman and thief." And he goes on a little bit from there. So is John B. Watson saying nature or nurture? Well, he is definitely saying nurture. So what does behaviorism emphasize? Nurture, in other words, the role of learning and environment. And that quote that I just gave you was on the next slide if you want to see it in its full exact glory. As a mnemonic to help you remember the name of the behaviors, think of the B people. So John B. Watson, pretend the B's for behaviors. I don't think he'd mind. B.F. Skinner, again, behaviors. And Ivan Pavlov, no B there, but he did care quite a bit about the behavior of his dogs. So if you remember the simple mnemonic, you won't accidentally tell me Rogers or Maslow or Freud. So remember, behaviors are the B people. So who is this very famous quote by? Well, definitely a behaviorist. Which one? Most definitely John B. Watson. As a mnemonic, remember, pretend the B stands for behaviorist. At this point, I'm assuming that you can identify our major behaviorists, but I want to check that assumption. So take a look at these three gentlemen, and let's see if you can indeed correctly identify them. So top left, John B. Watson, of course. To his right, Ivan Pavlov. And the bottom, B.F. Skinner. And the B also stands for behaviors. It stands for Berhus, but who wants to be called Berhus? So think of him as our behaviorist, at least one of three. Hopefully you did very well on this. I wanted to share this quote from you from B.F. Skinner. Consider it. A failure is not always a mistake. It may simply be the best one can do under the circumstances. The real mistake is to stop trying. So I asked my students, how many of you have gone to Hershey, Pennsylvania? And how many of you who raise your hands have gone to the factory for the tour? Well, you didn't learn on the tour that Hershey, his business failed not once, not two times, not three times, not four times, not five times, not six times, not seven times. You get the idea. But he kept trying it and reformulating it and trying and reformulating. He did not give up, and he became a tycoon and a major player in the chocolate empire. So apply that to your own life. Right now, it's at the tail end of the semester. Right now, it's the very end of May in 2020 as I narrate this. And some of my students were doing well in the class, but during the transition, they were not able to make it. So they gave up. They stopped trying. And that's sad. And sometimes trying is a good thing and not always successful, but certainly if the student didn't continue and didn't try, they wouldn't have been one of those students who succeeded. And most students did succeed. So please always give it a try. And if you're having difficulties, there are many services at college that you can reach out to, and all designed to help you succeed.